The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it happened. It's a great quote by George Bernard Shaw, and it's still true today, by the way. So many entrepreneurs, leaders, they think that they've communicated, but then they say things like, they didn't get it. They don't understand. I said it. I told them. I had the meeting. I sent the smoke signal. Yet nothing seems to change and nothing seems to get done. So in this episode, we're going to talk about some powerful communication ideas that's going to make sure that you don't just say it, but they get it. Welcome to the Shift Podcast. It's Evan and Matt. We are here at Renaissance Hotel in downtown Denver. We're kind of stuck in a vault right now. It's a very secure place to record a podcast.
Yeah, nobody's going to bother us in here.
Nobody's going to bother us. Effective communication is one of the most necessary, but one of the most difficult skills that entrepreneurs do well. Why is that?
Yeah, you're right. And it absolutely is a necessary skill. Communication is a vital skill for leaders to have and to learn and to master. In fact, I would say it this way, that you cannot be an effective leader if you're not an effective communicator. Or at the very least, your impact is going to be limited if your communication skills are limited. And I think sometimes we think about communication, in a leadership role as like standing on a stage in front of a big crowd of people. And that's one form of communication, but it's only one form. And it's honestly not the form that most leaders are going to use most of the time. Effective communication isn't about, are you a good public speaker or are you a good writer? Or it's not about any one of those things specifically. It's more about, can I communicate and express myself in such a way that people get it, that they get the message? Because what we all know, and you alluded to it a moment ago, is we can say, well, I said it, they just didn't get it.
They just didn't get it.
And we always want to be quick to blame the hearer, the receiver of the communication. And I think, leaders taking extreme ownership, like we always talk about around here, we've got to realize that maybe they didn't get it because I didn't communicate it well. I didn't communicate it in a way that landed on the audience, that they resonated with, that they could really grab a hold of.
Yeah. I think the result of not communicating well, and we can just kind of look for this, is it's confusing for the person on the receiving end.
Right.
So it's like, yeah, no, we had the meeting, but I wasn't clear on my directive.
Yeah.
Or, yeah, I read the email, but I still didn't really understand what they were trying to say to me.
Yeah.
And we've all had this experience, right? It's a really common scenario.
Yeah. So somebody on the receiving end would say, it's not that I didn't receive any communication. It wasn't, I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it.
Right.
Like, cool, I have this long email, TLDR, too long to read, too long didn't read. But now I don't know now what, right? Delete, right?
Yeah, right.
Or file it away, whatever the case might be. In my experience, most leaders simply aren't as clear as they need to be in those communications. And I think that happens at all levels. It's with teammates, it's with customers and clients, it's with vendors, it's everyone in the org chart, whether it's above you, below you, peer with you. I think, in most cases, we just avoid being as clear as we want to be or need to be. And I think a lot of that stems from leaders wanting to be nice.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
Like, I want to be nice. I don't want to hurt people's feelings. I don't want to ruffle feathers. I don't want to step on their toes. Or maybe I do want to, but I know I'm not supposed to, right? And so I dial it back in a way, I dial back my communication in such a way that I think it'll be soft enough and palatable enough that people can hear what needs to be said. The problem is that so many times in doing that, we've dialed it back so much that now we're not clear. And so the big point that I want to make here is that when it comes to communication for a leader, to be clear is to be kind. To be clear is to be kind. And the irony is that sometimes when we try too hard to be nice, we're trying to be kind, we actually become unclear.
Yep.
Because now we're concerned more about someone's feelings in the moment than about the communication that they need to receive. And so it's an irony because we're trying to be kind, so we become unclear, which is unkind. And so it's sort of a self-defeating, kind of mechanism, People need clarity from you. They want clarity from you. If you're a leader, I promise your people are craving the clarity that only you can bring because you're the leader that can speak into those situations. And to be clear is to be kind. To be unclear is to be unkind.
Yeah, I like what you said. To be clear is to be kind. And we, as leaders, we do need to just be more clear. But what do you think is really behind it? Why do leaders struggle so much with just saying it like it is?
Well, I think that if we're being honest, every one of us want to be liked.
Yeah,
Right?
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to look at some people who maybe have really strong personality and they're drivers and they're ambitious and like, well, they don't need people and they don't have a need for approval or validation or whatever. Right. And certainly some people may have more or less need for it, but I've yet to meet a human being that doesn't have some need for that. Sure. Everybody wants to be liked. Of course, yeah. And especially if we're talking, internally with your team particularly, you want your team to like you. You want your team to admire you and respect you and all of those things. And so sometimes I think the desire to be liked makes us, again, dial back the communication in such a way, like I want it to be soft enough. I want to be nice. I don't want to tick anybody off.
Right.
And so this desire to be liked, I think, is a really big deal. It reminds me of the old Office episode where somebody asked Michael Scott the question, would you rather be feared or loved? And his response, classic, is, I want both. I want people to be afraid of how much they love me, right? Yeah. And I think deep down inside, like all of us have that need. Like we want to be liked and respected. Like we want all of that to go together. But leaders have to be willing to communicate in a way that's clear, even if it's uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Even if it's uncomfortable for you as the leader, and even if it's uncomfortable for the person on the other end of it, on the receiving end. I think people actually respect you more when you're clear than when you're unclear. Even in a hard moment, even in a hard conversation, even if, man, this is a difficult topic, difficult meeting, this doesn't feel good. And yet at the end of the day, I can respect the person because they were willing to say what needed to be said. Mm-hmm. They were willing to be clear. And again, people want clarity more than you think they do. They crave it more than you think they do. And I think there's often a disconnect between us as leaders and our team because what's clear to us is not always clear to them. And so if we can't communicate it in a clear way, they're going to have that confusion like you talked about. Sure. And it's this whole idea of like clarity trumps confusion. Yep. And it doesn't even mean that you have to have certainty all the time. I've been in a lot of situations as a leader where it's like, man, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not certain about outcomes, but I'm clear about the next step. I'm clear about the direction that we need to go. And that kind of clears up all the confusion around it. And so again, I would just hit this point home that to be clear is to be kind, and to be unclear is to be unkind.
Yeah. Okay, so a lot of bad communication can be attributed to, let's just say, not wanting to ruffle feathers or the desire to be liked. So what if you're doing your best to communicate to a team member and it's just not landing?
Yeah. Oh, and we've all been in that situation, right? Where we're communicating and they just don't seem to be like really getting it. At least not at the level that we like. They're nodding and they're smiling and they're even giving us like verbal feedback. But like we know deep down inside, like you don't get this at the level I need you to get it at, right? You think you got it, but you don't really got it, right? And so this is something that for me, we didn't come up with this. This is something I shamelessly stole from somebody who stole it from somebody else who stole it from somebody else, right? Like, no, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Like these leadership principles, so much of what we talk about on the Shift podcast, it's not original to us. No, we're putting our spin on it. We're sharing our experiences. But a lot of these things that we talk about, that we read about, the podcasts we listen to, these are just tried and true principles that just straight up work, right? And so this is a concept that I've tried to employ in my leadership, and somebody framed it this way. They call it the last 10%. Okay. The last 10%. I've read several books that have talked about that. The idea is that for most leaders, even when they're being clear, even when they're not holding back, they're being clear about it, they don't give the person they're talking to the last 10% of what really needs to be said. And the reason why is because the last 10% is the part that could really hurt.
Yep.
That's the part that can make them really uncomfortable, could really like put them on edge, could make them feel apprehensive in some way. And again, I don't want to do that. So that last 10%, that's where I hold back. That's where I hedge a little bit, and I kind of squirm because it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
The issue is that the last 10% is really like the heart of the whole thing, right? Like we had to have this other 90% of the conversation for me to, because the 10% is what's underneath it, right? Like how many meetings have you been in? Like a one-on-one, a coaching conversation, like, okay, this is a 30-minute meeting and we're kind of beating around the bush for the first 25 minutes. And the 5 minutes at the end, like that's what really needed to be said, right? Like it's that last 10%. And by the way, I think this is true not just in professional relationships, this is true in personal relationships. Where, again, in an effort to maintain the relationship, I don't want to risk losing the person, losing the relationship, causing a problem or some major disruption. And so I hold back just a little bit, whether that's with a spouse or romantic partner, maybe it's with, a parent-child relationship, with friends. I think this happens a lot with friends. We just gloss over things because I don't want to lose the friendship. Last 10%, I think leaders just have to make a commitment. I'm going to be a last 10% person. I'm going to be willing to say the last 10% of what really needs to be said and face the whole thing and deal with the discomfort of it. Because if I don't, I'm really not being fair to myself because I'm going to hold the last 10%. And I'm not being fair to the person because they're not getting the essence of what they need to get.
Yeah, I know. I'm thinking of a couple conversations in my mind, right? And those watching, listening, you probably have at least a few conversations with people in your mind as well, where you can apply the last 10%. So far, we've kind of talked about the last 10% as being a, correction or redirection, right?
Right.
Disciplinary. But can we apply the last 10% in a positive conversation as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I would say everything we're talking about, and you're right, maybe it has been framed just from the negative or corrective side. But I would say, both the idea of to be clear is to be kind and last 10%, it applies to positive just as much as negative, right? Because we can also, going back to being clear as being kind, if you give someone just a vague compliment, hey, you did a great job at work today. Like that's not nearly as meaningful as a very specific, clear, like, hey, when you talk to that, I overheard you talking to that customer on the phone and you resolved that issue and you handled it so well. I was so proud of you. Well, that clarity is way more effective than just you did a good job at work today.
That's so good.
Right?
Yes.
And so I think being clear is important, whether we're talking about a positive or a negative situation, whether it's correction or praise. Last 10%, I think is the same thing. Sometimes leaders, and this is interesting. I think sometimes leaders we can hold back on giving the hard feedback because we don't want to hurt people's feelings. I think sometimes we hold back on giving the good feedback too.
Yeah, I can see that.
I think sometimes we're stingy with our praise.
Sure.
And that could come from a lot of different places, right? Like maybe in the back of our minds, like we're still thinking I could do this job better than you because I'm the boss, I'm the leader, I'm the owner or whatever. And so it's like, yeah, good job, but I don't want to, you still have a ways to go, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe it's our own insecurity. Like we don't want them to have too much confidence, right? They're going to think they run the place, right? We don't want them to get too big for their britches. Their head can't fit through the doorway or whatever it is.
In my mind, it's like, I don't want to give an employee too much praise because they might let off the gas. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
I'm doing so good now I can just coast. Right. Yeah. And so I think sometimes we can be stingy on our praise, but I think that's a huge mistake too. I think in the same way that not giving the last 10% of hard feedback is a problem, I think not giving the last 10% of good feedback is a problem too. And we've talked about this in another episode, the power of encouragement, right? Like you cannot overestimate the power that your encouragement as a leader is going to have on the people around you. And the reason why is because if you're the leader, and we're talking about, in this context, this part of the conversation, maybe people on your team, they look to you to know how they're doing, right? Just like a kid looks to their parents for the feedback, your team members look to you as the leader to know how they're doing. And their sense of their job performance is based in a lot of ways around the feedback that they get from you. Yeah. And so they crave that attention and that affirmation from you. And when they don't get it, they're sort of left in the dark. Like in your mind, you're like, well, yeah, you're doing fine, so I didn't need to say anything. In reality, like that puts them in this place of, I don't know how I'm doing, right? So this vacuum of communication, I think, is a major problem. And we've got to remember that our words as leaders carry a ton of weight.
Yeah, they do. Right?
Like when you're in a leadership role, your praise or lack thereof speaks so much to your team members. And don't underestimate how a small cutting remark is something they're going to stew on for a week.
Yeah.
And a bit of amount of praise is something that's going to just light them up for a long time. And again, I think leaders a lot of times are stingy about this. I remember Craig Rochelle, great, pastor and leadership podcast. He talks about this. He says, however much praise and encouragement you think you should give more to the point that it makes you feel uncomfortable, and then double that.
Wow. So a whole lot more.
Yeah. And so, I mean, he's sort of painting this picture of like, when you think you've like overdone it, you're just getting started.
You're just getting started,
right?
Yeah.
Because you can't over encourage someone. And Maxwell talks about this, the idea, and he actually he stole this from his dad, who he said was a master encourager. He said that his dad said that someone needs encouragement if they're breathing. right? Like we all need encouragement.
Yeah.
It's the oxygen of the soul. And so again, back to this context of communication, what this whole episode is about is encourage people. Give them the last 10% encouragement. Give them the clear encouragement. You can't overdo the positive encouragement and feedback that you're going to give people. And I would say this, and this is why it's important to have both. If I can't trust your criticism, then I can't trust your compliments.
Nice.
If I can't trust that when you compliment me, you're being sincere, how will I trust that when you're giving me feedback, hard feedback, that it's sincere, that it's not just emotional, right? If I can't trust that you're honest when you give me hard feedback, how can I trust that you're being honest when you praise me?
That's good.
I think we've got to have it on both sides.
I do too. I can imagine just saying that to a team member as you're having a hard conversation. Like, hey, this is going to be a tough conversation. I want to make sure that you get it, because if you can't trust me with this, you won't trust me when I compliment you.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's got to be both ways.
Yeah. So I think a good example of that, that we get to see, on broadcast would be like American Idol or Shark Tank or something like that, right? Like those are brutal environments where, Mr. Wonderful or Simon Cowell, like they give very, very hard feedback to those, talent on stage, or to the entrepreneurs or whatever. But when they give praise and compliments, you know that it's sincere, right? Like when Simon Cowell says that you sound good, you actually do, right? Like you can take that to the bank because he has no problem. And these are guys who both, like, they get the clarity thing right.
Yeah.
They get the last 10% right. Now, the last 10% is sometimes really hard to hear, really hard to swallow. But to your point of like, you can trust their compliment because they were honest with the criticism.
That's right.
Right? Like they get it right on both sides of that.
Yeah, I like that. So let's switch gears. Work from home. It's a real thing, right? An insane amount of companies are allowing their employees to work from home.
Right.
So let's talk about effective communication in a digital setting, right?
Okay.
Let's say
like a not face-to-face kind of
right.
thing.
Yeah, over Zoom, sending an email.
Sure.
How can we make sure that this kind of communication is effective?
Yeah, well, I would say this: if you have remote or hybrid team members, it is more challenging. There's just no way around it, right? Because there are always nuances that are lost when you're not face-to-face. Like face-to-face conversation is always going to give you the most data points in terms of the communication itself, because as we know, and I don't know what the percentage is, but it's something like 70% of communication is nonverbal. I think that's right.
Oh, wow.
Or at least it's above 50%,
it's a lot,
right? Yeah,
right.
It's a lot, right? So we know that every layer that you take away of the personal connection means that there are things that are just lost or potentially lost in translation. So I think we've got to just be really intentional about that. And I would say this: I think we're living in an age where too many leaders are hiding behind some of those non-face-to-face methods of communication.
For sure.
Because it's easier, right?
That's
like
right.
I'm more likely to say something in an email than I am to say it face to face. Like I may want to communicate the same thing, but the way I would do it, the way I would say it and phrase it if I'm sitting face to face with you compared to just blasting an email is totally different. And I think leaders who hide behind emails, corporate memos, text messages, like all those kinds of things, if you're doing it because you're avoidant in some way, I would just say to you, you need to man up. You've got to bring a bigger self to the table in those kinds of situations. If you can't have hard conversations, you can't be a leader. If you won't have hard conversations, you aren't a leader. I would just say it that way. I don't care what your title is. You're not really leading. You may be a boss, but you're not a leader. You've got to be willing to have hard conversations. Now, again, there's a time and a place. I'm not saying you just rush in, bull in a china shop. You got to calm down. You got to pick your moments, like all of those kind of things. But my rule of thumb personally for every team that I've led is this. We can use those digital and especially written forms of communication, email, text, Slack, those kind of things. We can use information. We can use those methods for anything that's like information, that's logistical, that's, coordinating, tactical types of things like that. But if at any point we need to discuss something that has an emotion attached to it, anything that could be perceived as controversial, confrontational, we need to deal with something, and it could either be one-sided or we got to put our heads together on it. Anything that has the potential to go sideways because there's an emotional component to it. For me, the rule is we have to hear each other's voice.
That's right.
Right. So we pick up the phone or we get on a Zoom call or, again, person, face-to-face is the best. But in the absence of that, we can at least pick up the phone. We can at least get on a Zoom. And in my mind, those interactions go so much better than if you're trying to deal with a conflict type of situation in written communication.
For sure. I mean, and there's such a big difference between written and spoken.
Oh, yeah.
There?
Huge.
Early 2024, the stats are something like 58% of businesses at least offered work from home, remote work to their employees. Imagine the thousands of emails or Slack messages that are going across that are misinterpreted.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
It's a problem.
Yeah. Well, I actually had this happen just a couple of weeks ago with one of my clients on the marketing agency, and I'm using another firm to for some of the deliverables, and I'm kind of navigating all these relationships. And the client sends an email, and the media buyer sent a response, and I knew what both of them meant, but they didn't know what each other meant. And then they kind of got upset with each other, and I had to intervene. I'm like, you guys, we could have fixed this with like a 5-minute phone call instead of like a flurry of emails going back and forth. But again, I think sometimes people are hiding behind these things. And honestly, I think it's deteriorating morale in the workplace for a lot of people. And I think it's not good.
So it sounds to me like your beef is with the written form of communication.
Well, maybe this is my soapbox to talk about this because
this is your soapbox.
It's our podcast. Like we can talk about whatever we want, right? And it is just it's personal opinion and personal preference. I just am seeing this become more and more of a problem, and I think the younger person in the workforce, they tend, they grew up with all of these forms of communication. They grew up texting and DMs and all of that, and so I see them using that more. And I'm not saying that it's all bad, but I think sometimes it has taken the place of having really good social and interpersonal, conflict resolution skills and all of that. And it's really easy to fall into. Even if you're not of that generation, it's just easy to fall into it. And I think back, this was, I don't know, a month or so ago, you and I were having a conversation via text.
I remember that.
And it was logistical, and we were just running through information. And all of a sudden, it felt, and this was a feeling, but it felt like something changed.
Right.
Like we were not understanding each other, and it felt. And again, it's all a feeling, right? This is via text, so I'm sort of projecting this. It may not have even been true, but from my perspective, like I felt like maybe you were getting frustrated, and I knew I was getting frustrated, and I mean we all know how fast this can like spiral down.
And then I saw your call come in.
Right. And I'm like, you know what? This is stupid. Like, we're going to pick up the phone and we're going to talk through this. Now, as it turned out, it wasn't as big of a deal as the text might have alluded to. But I think that's where my beef with written communication comes in, is because for whatever reason, like we fill in the blanks, right? We fill in the gaps with our own interpretation of what's happening. And I think this is where so much communication can just go sideways, again, whether it's in personal or in professional relationships. So, things get taken out of context, things get misinterpreted, misconstrued. I just say stop, pick up the phone, deal with it.
Deal with it.
Yeah.
So we've spent the majority of this episode talking about communication in the context of leadership, right?
Right. Yep.
But learning the skill of communication, it's going to make you so much more effective in other areas of your life.
Yeah.
So we have 2 concepts, right? That I'm going to summarize. That was to be clear is to be kind. And then the last one is to give the last 10%. That's where it's going to get really uncomfortable, but that's where the real magic happens in communication.
For sure.
So we want to encourage the audience now to communicate with that spoken form of communication versus the written.
Right.
Pick
as
up
much
the
as you
phone.
can.
Yeah. Pick up the phone, meet in person, get a coffee. I think it's really going to pay off in the end.
Yeah.
So, hey, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Shift Podcast. Be sure to like, share, subscribe as usual, and we hope to see you guys on the next one. See ya.